Fine, let's start. Number 1. The Sverresborg Well-Man. Deep in the ruins of a Norwegian castle, a lamp swings down a stone shaft and catches the pale curve of a human skull resting in black water at the bottom of a well. That body had been lying there for roughly 900 years. And the strangest part is this. A medieval book had already told the world he was down there. The Sverre saga is an Old Norse chronicle about King Sverre Sigurdsson. It describes a raid in the year 1197, when an enemy faction called the Baglar attacked Sverresborg Castle near modern Trondheim. According to the saga, the attackers took a dead man and threw his body into the castle's drinking well to poison the water and drive the defenders out. For centuries, that was just a line in an old story. Human bones were first noticed in the well back in 1938, but the Second World War interrupted any study, and the remains were left alone for decades. Archaeologists finally recovered the full skeleton in 2014 and 2016. Radiocarbon dating placed his death at about 900 years ago, which lines up almost exactly with that 1197 raid. Then, in 2024, a team led by Michael Martin at the Norwegian University of Science and Technology did something never done before. They sequenced the DNA of a person named in the sagas. The results described a man between 30 and 40 years old, with blue eyes, light hair, and pale skin. His ancestry pointed not to the Trondheim region, but to southern Norway, the area once called Vest-Agder. That detail flips the story in a fascinating way. He may not have been a local defender at all. He may have been one of the raiders. The saga only says a body went into the well. The science cannot prove this is the exact man in the text, only that the timing, the place, and the act all match. The preservation was owed to the cold, waterlogged, oxygen-starved mud at the bottom of the shaft, which slowed decay for 9 centuries. Before any DNA work, ordinary osteology, the study of the bones themselves, had already established his sex, his rough age, and his height. Sverresborg had been built by King Sverre in the late 12th century as a fortified royal seat, so the well sat at the heart of a working castle. The real breakthrough was the method itself, pairing an old written text with genomics and radiocarbon to test whether a legend describes something that truly happened. Think about what this means. A single sentence in a medieval manuscript, a throwaway war crime from 800 years ago, turned out to be describing a real body you could hold in your hands. And if one saga line is literally true, it forces a question. How many other legends are waiting under the ground to be proven? Number 2. Takabuti. In 1835, a crowd of curious Victorians packed into a room in Belfast to watch an Egyptian mummy be unwrapped for the very first time in Ireland. They came for a spectacle. None of them realized they were staring at the victim of a murder. The woman was named Takabuti. She was a Theban noblewoman, a mistress of a great house, who lived around 660 BCE. Her mummy had been bought in Egypt and shipped to Belfast in 1834, and she has been an icon in Northern Ireland ever since, kept today at the Ulster Museum. Around 2020, a large team from National Museums Northern Ireland, the University of Manchester, Queen's University Belfast, and a local hospital brought her into the modern age. They put her through a CT scanner, and the scan found something the Victorian showman had missed. There was a knife wound in her upper back, near her left shoulder blade. The injury was inflicted while she was still alive. Takabuti had been stabbed, almost certainly from behind. The scan corrected an old mistake too. Earlier researchers had thought her heart was missing, but it was there all along, intact inside her chest. Radiocarbon dating refined her age to about 660 BCE. Her DNA held a surprise. Her maternal lineage, a mitochondrial haplogroup called H4A1, was more typically European than modern Egyptian, complicating any simple story about who she was. Her body carried other rare quirks, including an extra 33rd tooth and an extra vertebra. The work was carried out by researchers including Professor Rosalie David of Manchester and Professor Eileen Murphy of Queen's, and it was timed to the 185th anniversary of her unwrapping in Belfast. The embalmers had packed unusual material into the wound and body cavity, which had confused the earlier examiners and helped hide the injury for so long. Now, here the case splits open. Was this a robbery that turned violent? A targeted killing? Something inside her own household? The angle of the wound points to an attack from behind, not an accident, and not her own hand. But the identity of the person who drove that blade into her back is gone forever. Modern imaging solved how she died. It cannot tell us who did it. And that is the quiet horror of Takabuti. For 185 years, people filed past her glass case and saw a curiosity, an ancient object. The whole time, they were looking at unsolved evidence, a homicide victim waiting 2,500 years for someone to finally read the wound. Number 3. The Screaming Mummy, Unknown Man E. His mouth is wrenched open in a frozen, silent scream, and instead of fine royal linen, his body is wrapped in the skin of a goat. He was found in 1886 by Gaston Maspero inside a hidden royal cache near Deir el-Bahari, tucked among the reburied kings of Egypt. Everything about him was wrong. Egyptian royalty were embalmed with enormous care and wrapped in the finest cloth. This man had been treated like an outcast, sealed in ritually impure animal skin, his face contorted in agony. For over a century, he was simply labeled Unknown Man E. Then, in 2012, a study led by Zahi Hawass and Albert Zink ran his DNA and compared it to the pharaohs around him. The result was stunning. He was a son of Ramesses III. That single fact unlocked one of history's oldest murder mysteries, the harem conspiracy. Around 1155 BCE, a secondary wife of Ramesses III named Taye plotted to assassinate the king and put her own son, Prince Pentawar, on the throne. We know this because the trial survives, written on a document called the Judicial Papyrus of Turin. It records that Pentawar was found guilty and made to take his own life. The DNA showed that Unknown Man E and Ramesses III shared the same paternal Y chromosome line, confirming the father and son link. The screaming face may reflect a death by hanging, or a jaw left unbound before the body stiffened. The impure goatskin wrapping looks like a deliberate punishment, reaching beyond death, denying him a proper afterlife. And the same 2012 study cracked the other half of the case. When they scanned Ramesses III himself, they found his throat had been cut, a deep wound severing the windpipe and major vessels. The embalmers had even tucked a protective amulet, a Horus eye, into the wound to heal it by magic. There is a reason a disgraced prince ended up hidden among kings. His scans showed none of the careful embalming incisions of an elite burial, supporting the idea that he was punished. Yet the royal cache where he lay, known as DB-320, had been created centuries later to protect the mummies of the pharaohs from tomb robbers by hiding them all together. So the plot succeeded. The king was killed, the conspirators were tried, and a disgraced prince was punished so thoroughly that his corpse was wrapped in shame. 3,000 years later, a papyrus and a strand of DNA reached across time and named both the victim and the son who paid for the crime. Number 4. Cangrande della Scala. A warlord rides in triumph through the gates of a city he has just conquered, cheered by crowds at the absolute peak of his power. Within days, he is dead. His name was Cangrande, the first della Scala, born 1291, the lord of Verona and a famous patron of the poet Dante, On the 22nd of July, 1329, only days after his triumphant entry into the captured city of Treviso, he died suddenly. The official story was harmless. He had supposedly drunk from a polluted spring and come down with a sudden fever. His body was placed in a grand marble tomb, the Scaliger tombs of Verona, where the sealed stone created a microclimate that naturally mummified his remains. In 2004, his body was exhumed for scientific study by a team including paleopathologists from the University of Pisa. Because he was so well preserved, they could analyze his tissues, his hair, and even the contents of his gut. What they found rewrote his death certificate. Toxicology revealed a lethal concentration of digitalis, the poison drawn from the foxglove plant. Digitalis in overdose causes exactly what the chronicles described: vomiting and diarrhea before it stops the heart with a fatal rhythm. The study, led by Gino Fornaciari around 2015, concluded that Cangrande had been poisoned. This was almost certainly an assassination. They also found chamomile and mulberry in his system, possibly given as a remedy, or possibly used to disguise the taste of the poison. And here the historical record whispers agreement. After Cangrande's death, one of his physicians was reportedly hanged, a sign that people at the time already suspected foul play. Foxglove is not something you swallow by accident from a spring. It is a deliberate, knowledgeable poison, chosen by someone who understood exactly what it would do. Fornaciari's group in Pisa is the same team behind the famous Medici project, which has exhumed and studied Italian nobles for clues to how they lived and died. By measuring the actual concentration in his tissue, they could tell a therapeutic dose from a fatal one, and his was fatal. Modern instruments like mass spectrometry are sensitive enough to pull a specific drug out of tissue that has been sitting in a tomb for centuries. The political stakes were enormous, throwing the Della Scala dynasty into a succession crisis. For nearly 700 years, the death of one of medieval Italy's most powerful men was written off as a fever. Modern chemistry pulled the truth out of his mummified tissue and revealed the murder hiding inside it. Number 5. Ava of Achavanich. On a bleak highland moor in 1987, workers uncovered a grave that should have been almost impossible to dig. It was cut straight down into solid bedrock, and inside lay a young woman with a strangely shaped skull. She is known today as Ava, named for Achavanich in Caithness in the far north of Scotland. She was buried around 1700 BCE, in the early Bronze Age, in what archaeologists call the Beaker period. Cutting a grave into rock took enormous effort, a sign she mattered to her community. She was laid to rest with a decorated beaker pot, a piece of cattle bone, and a flint tool. Her skull was unusually short and broad, which caught the eye of researchers. Starting around 2016, an independent researcher named Maya Houle launched a modern project to study her. A forensic artist, Hugh Morrison, used her skull measurements to rebuild her face, turning a set of bones back into a young woman with dark hair and striking features. Then ancient DNA revealed her deep story. Ava belonged to the Beaker people, and her genetics carried ancestry that traced back to the steppe, far to the east. This matters because of what the Beaker people did to Britain. A landmark study published in 2018 showed that when they arrived, they replaced roughly 90% of the earlier gene pool within just a few centuries. The farmers who had built Britain's first great monuments were almost entirely swept aside. Ava is a single human face placed on that staggering statistic. For years, some scholars argued that such changes were just ideas and pottery spreading between peaceful populations. Ava's DNA supports a very different picture, an actual migration of people moving in and largely displacing those already there. Her short skull, once suspected of being a deformity, turned out to be perfectly normal variation for her population. What made her project stand out was how many methods it combined on one person: the study of her bones, ancient DNA, and forensic art all brought together and shared openly with the public rather than locked away. Isotope work on beaker individuals like her also helps reveal what they ate and how far they moved in life. One woman, buried in rock at the edge of Scotland, quietly records one of the biggest turnovers of human population that Britain has ever seen. Number 6. The Driffield Terrace, Gladiators of York. On a Roman skeleton buried in the English city of York, there is a hip bone, and punched into that hip bone are the unmistakable teeth marks of a lion. That single detail solved a debate that had run for years. Driffield Terrace is a Roman cemetery in York, once the Roman city of Eboracum, excavated in 2004 and 2005. It held more than 80 burials, and the pattern was eerie. Most were young, powerfully built men, and many had been decapitated, their skulls placed in the grave beside them. They were taller than average and carried healed injuries, the marks of violent lives. Some archaeologists thought this was a cemetery of executed criminals or soldiers. Others suspected something more specific, a graveyard of gladiators. The answer came from one man, known by the code 6DT19, in a study published in 2025. His pelvis carried strange puncture wounds and scalloped lesions. A team led by Tim Thompson compared those marks to the bites of large carnivores, working with forensic and zoo specialists. The wounds matched a big cat, most consistent with a lion. This is the first physical proof, written on human bone, of a person fighting or being killed by an animal in the Roman arena, anywhere in the entire empire. Until this, human versus beast combat was known only from written accounts, mosaics, and art. The bite happened around the time of death, likely as the animal seized or dragged the incapacitated man. To be sure of the match, the team took comparison bite samples from large carnivores at modern zoos and measured them against the marks on the bone. The man himself, 6DT19, was aged roughly 26 to 35 and already carried older healed injuries, the signature of a fighting life. Chemical analysis of the men's teeth showed they came from all across the Roman world, drawn to this northern city. York was a major legionary base and a provincial capital, exactly the kind of place that would stage bloody public spectacle. The decapitations may have been a finishing blow after combat, or a separate ritual. Think of the logistics buried in this one skeleton. Somebody captured a lion, shipped it thousands of miles to the cold edge of the Roman world, and set it loose on a man for entertainment. For centuries, that was a story from books. Now it is a fact carved into a hip bone. Number 7. The Salme ship warriors. On a beach on the Estonian island of Saaremaa, archaeologists uncovered a wooden boat that had been turned into a mass grave, filled with the stacked bodies of armed men who had died fighting. The discoveries came in 2008 and 2010, and they quietly rewrote the timeline of the Viking Age. The two boats at Salme date to around 700 to 750 CE. That is decades before the year 793, the raid on Lindisfarne that history traditionally calls the start of the Viking Age. Together the boats held the remains of at least 41 men. The larger vessel alone contained about 34 individuals, layered on top of one another, buried with swords, shields, and rich goods. Many showed sharp force trauma, wounds from blades. These men died in battle, not from sickness. They were buried with ornate weapons, gaming pieces, and even the bones of dogs and hawks. Then ancient DNA delivered the most human detail of all. 4 of the men, laid side by side, were brothers. Others in the grave were more distant relatives. This was a war band built on family, kin who sailed and died together. Chemical and genetic data traced their origin across the sea to central Sweden, the Mälaren Valley region. The likely story is a raiding voyage or a diplomatic mission that went catastrophically wrong, ending in a deadly fight on foreign soil. The survivors dragged the boats ashore and used them as graves, giving the highest status men the finest weapons. One man was even buried with an ornate gaming piece, a marker of rank. Salme matters because it shows organized, boat-borne Scandinavian warfare happening a full lifetime before the Viking Age was supposed to begin. The swords were superb, some pattern welded by expert smiths. These were elite, well-fed fighters. Archaeologists call this era the Vendel period, the age just before the longships and the raids, and Salme is now one of the most important boat burials ever found in the Baltic, a bridge between the Sweden of that time and the Viking expansions that would soon follow. And the DNA turns an anonymous mass grave into something intimate. The opening chapter of the Viking story was fought and lost by brothers who were buried touching one another on a distant shore. Number 8. The Amesbury Archer. Just a few miles from Stonehenge, archaeologists opened a grave so rich it stopped them cold. Around 100 objects packed around a single body, including gold from a time when gold in Britain barely existed. It was discovered in 2002 at Amesbury in Wiltshire, and the man inside was buried around 2300 BCE, right when the great Sarsen stones were being raised at Stonehenge. His was the richest beaker period grave ever found in Britain. Around him lay 5 beaker pots, 16 flint arrowheads, stone wrist guards worn by archers, copper knives, and 2 ornaments of gold, among the earliest gold objects in the country. The copper knives had come from Spain and France, showing long-distance connections across Europe. But the real bombshell was in his teeth. Oxygen and strontium isotopes lock in a signature of the water and rock where a person grew up. His signature was not British. He had grown up in a colder place, the Alpine region of Central Europe, somewhere around modern Switzerland or Germany. The man buried with the most honor beside Britain's most famous monument was an immigrant from the continent. He was between 35 and 45 years old, and he had lived in constant pain. His left kneecap was missing, leaving him with a severe limp and a chronic bone infection. A younger man buried nearby shared a rare inherited foot bone trait with him, almost certainly a relative. His arrival lines up with the moment metalworking first reached Britain, which has led some to suggest he carried that rare and powerful knowledge with him. The nickname the press gave him, the King of Stonehenge, is a modern invention. Radiocarbon dating placed his burial in a window between about 2400 and 2200 BCE, and his story is often paired with the wider genetic evidence for the beaker migration that reshaped Britain's population. Today, his grave and its treasures are displayed at the Salisbury Museum, close to the monument he was buried beside. But the isotopes are not. They turned a local grave into evidence of movement on a continental scale. Here is the human core of it. A disabled man walked, or was carried, across Europe from the Alps to the plains of southern England, and when he died among the people who built Stonehenge, they honored him above all others. His own teeth, 4,000 years later, told us where he came from. Number 9. Seianti Hanunia Tlesnasa. On the lid of a painted coffin in the British Museum reclines a beautiful young woman, serene and graceful, adjusting her mantle for eternity. Then scientists rebuilt the face of the actual skull inside, and it belonged to someone else entirely. Her name was Seianti Hanunia Tlesnasa, an Etruscan aristocrat who lived in the 2nd century BCE near Chiusi in central Italy. Her terracotta sarcophagus is a masterpiece of Etruscan funerary art, showing an idealized, youthful beauty. But unusually, her actual skeleton survived alongside it, which meant researchers could test the portrait against the person. Around the year 2000, a team from the British Museum, working with forensic experts, reconstructed her face from her skull. The woman who emerged was far older and more careworn than the serene figure on the lid, roughly 50 to 55 years old. Her bones and teeth told a hard story. She had a serious abscess in her jaw, an advanced gum disease, which would have caused chronic pain. She also carried a healed injury consistent with a fall from a horse, damage to her hip and pelvis. That points to an active, aristocratic life spent riding. The comparison delivered a powerful lesson. Etruscan portraiture idealized people, It did not record them. The lovely young woman on the coffin was a flattering fiction, while the real Seianti aged, ached, and was likely worn down by infection. Her name and titles are written on the sarcophagus in Etruscan script, and the quality of the painting shows her wealth. This was a landmark in the field, sometimes called putting a face on the past. Forensic reconstruction applied to ancient Italy, with anatomical experts and a forensic artist working together from the skull outward. She lived during the era when Rome was rising to swallow the Etruscan world, a civilization that would soon be absorbed and half forgotten. The chronic infection in her jaw would have caused constant pain and could even have contributed to her death by spreading through her body. What makes her case so valuable is that it is a matched set, a work of art, and the actual person it claims to depict, side by side. And it carries a warning that reaches far beyond her. Every idealized face we admire from the ancient world, every perfect statue and serene portrait, may be hiding a real, aging, suffering human being underneath. Seianti is the proof, a 2,000-year-old beautiful lie with a real, tired woman resting inside it. Number 10. The Herculaneum glass brain. Inside the skull of a young man who died on a wooden bed nearly 2,000 years ago, researchers found fragments of shiny black glass. Those fragments were his brain. The place was Herculaneum, a Roman town that, like Pompeii, was destroyed by the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in the year 79 CE. But Herculaneum did not die slowly under falling ash. It was hit by pyroclastic surges, avalanches of superheated gas and ash moving at terrible speed. Many residents fled to boat chambers along the waterfront and died there. This particular young man, around 20 years old, was found face down on a wooden bed inside a building called the Collegium Augustaleum. When researchers examined his skull, they found glossy black material where his brain had been. It had been vitrified, meaning it was transformed into glass by being heated intensely and then cooling very fast. A study led by Pier Paolo Petrone, published in a major medical journal in 2020, described the impossible detail. To turn brain tissue into glass required temperatures of at least around 510 degrees Celsius, followed by rapid cooling. Under electron microscopes, the team reported preserved neurons, the actual wiring of his brain, locked inside the glass. This is the only known case of naturally vitrified human brain tissue anywhere on Earth, and it rewrote how these people died. Slow suffocation could never do this. This man was killed almost instantly by a brief, ferocious blast of heat. Analysis detected proteins found in human brain tissue and fatty acids from human hair in the samples, and the charred wooden bed gave an independent clue to the temperature. The team even reported vitrified tissue from his spinal cord as well, not just his brain. Later researchers have debated the precise temperatures and the exact mechanism, but the finding that his tissue had turned to glass held up under materials analysis. It is important to separate this from other preserved brains, like the boiled Iron Age brain found at Heslington in England. Those are soft tissue that survived. This is something stranger, organic matter flash frozen into glass. The heat that struck this young man was so extreme that it turned the very seat of his thoughts into obsidian. It is a way to die that science had never documented in a human body until they looked inside that skull. Number 11. Juanita, the Inca Ice Maiden. High on a Peruvian volcano in 1995, melting ice gave up the frozen body of a girl in brilliantly colored clothing, sitting exactly where she had been left more than 500 years before. She is called Juanita, or the Lady of Ampato, and she was found by the archaeologist Johann Reinhard and the climber Miguel Zarate after ash from a neighboring volcano melted the ice that had hidden her. She was a girl of about 12 to 15 years old, sacrificed by the Inca around 1440 to 1450 CE. Her death was part of a ritual called capacocha, in which the Inca offered children to their gods on the peaks of sacred mountains. The freezing preserved her almost perfectly. Her organs, her skin, her fine woven textiles, and the figurines and pottery buried with her. Researchers scanned her with CT machines, first at Johns Hopkins and later in Peru, studying her without ever unwrapping her body. The scans found the answer to how she died. There was a devastating blow to the right side of her skull, causing a fracture and a large hemorrhage. The pattern of bleeding proved she died from that single strike, not from the cold and not from strangulation. For years, scholars had debated how these mountain victims were killed. In Juanita's case, it was blunt force trauma. But her body held one more haunting record. Analysis of her hair showed her diet changing in her final months, rich with maize and animal protein, meaning she had been specially selected and fed. It also revealed coca and alcohol in her last weeks, part of the ritual that prepared her. She was healthy, well-nourished, and chosen for her physical perfection to be given to a god. Her preservation rivals that of Otzi the Iceman for scientific value. Johann Reinhard recovered several of these high-altitude mummies through the 1990s, and later discoveries, like the Lulailaco children found in Argentina, show the same ritual pattern, but were killed in different ways. The capacocha was not only religion, it was a tool of the Inca state, reinforcing its control over the peoples it had conquered. She rests today, still frozen, in a museum in Arequipa, and her own hair recorded the countdown of her final year. A child was fattened, dressed in finery, drugged, carried up a freezing volcano, and killed with one blow. All so that a mountain would be pleased, and her frozen body kept every detail of that final year on record. Number 12. Richard III. Beneath the painted white lines of a car park in the English city of Leicester, archaeologists dug into the soil and found the skeleton of a king, his spine twisted into a dramatic curve, crammed into a grave that was too short for him. Richard III, born 1452, was the last Plantagenet king of England. He was killed at the Battle of Bosworth Field on the 22nd of August, 1485, a death that ended the Wars of the Roses and began the Tudor dynasty. He had been buried at a friary called Greyfriars in Leicester, but the building was demolished long ago, and the location of his grave was lost. In 2012, a University of Leicester team, led by Richard Buckley, working with the writer Philippa Langley, excavated the car park built over the old friary. In a hastily dug, too-short grave beneath the choir of the vanished church, they found him. The skeleton had severe scoliosis, a sideways curve of the spine, exactly matching historical descriptions of Richard's uneven shoulders. Radiocarbon dating fit the late 15th century. The bones carried 11 wounds from around the time of death, 9 of them to the skull, showing he had lost his helmet. 2 blows to the base of the skull, likely from a bladed pole weapon and a sword, would have killed him fast. There were also insult wounds inflicted after death, including a stab to the pelvis. Then came the proof of identity. Mitochondrial DNA from the skeleton matched 2 living descendants of Richard's sister, including a man named Michael Ibsen. Bones, radiocarbon, family trees, and DNA together identified him beyond reasonable doubt. The genetics even predicted he likely had blue eyes and blonde childhood hair. The Y chromosome told a stranger story, revealing a break somewhere in the supposed male line of his relatives, a hint of hidden paternity in the royal family tree. Isotopes in his bones and teeth traced his diet and where he lived through his life, including a shift to richer food and more wine after he became king. His scoliosis raised one shoulder, but did not make him the hunchbacked monster of Tudor propaganda. The discovery of a named medieval king under a modern car park became one of the most famous archaeological identifications ever made, precisely because so many independent lines of evidence pointed to the same man. In 2015, he was reburied with honor in Leicester Cathedral. His coffin built by a descendant of his own family line. The most slandered villain in English history had his real body, his real disability, and the exact manner of his death read back after 5 centuries, and the winner's story was finally checked against his bones. Look back across these 12, and the same small set of tools keeps reopening the deepest past. The CT scanner lets researchers look inside a sealed mummy or an unbroken skull without destroying anything, which is how they found the knife wound in Takabuti, the skull fracture in Juanita, and the cut throat of a pharaoh. Ancient DNA answers questions of identity and family, revealing the brothers at Salme, the descendants who matched Richard III, and the ancestry hidden in Ava's bones. Isotopes locked in tooth enamel record where a person grew up and what they ate, which is how a man buried at Stonehenge was exposed as an immigrant from the Alps, and how the fighters of York were traced across the empire. Toxicology and mass spectrometry pulled drugs and poisons out of centuries-old tissue, catching the foxglove that killed Cangrande and the coca in a sacrificed girl's hair. Forensic taphonomy reads the marks on bone, matching a lion's bite to a Roman hip and a halberd blow to a king's skull. Facial reconstruction turns a skull back into a face, giving us Ava, Seianti, and Richard as they may have looked in life. And material science can even identify the impossible. A brain turned to glass. The pattern underneath all of it is the same. Scientists take a physical body and cross-check it against a surviving text, a saga, a papyrus, a chronicle, and see whether the two agree. Radiocarbon dating sits underneath all of it, anchoring each body to a real point in time and letting researchers test whether a date in a text can be trusted. And there is a quiet advantage to the modern approach, because scanners and tiny tissue samples do not destroy a body the way a Victorian unwrapping did. These remains survive intact for the next generation of tests, ones not yet invented. Each method answers a different question. Who was this? Where were they from? How did they die? When did it happen? Often the science nails how someone died, while the question of who killed them stays open forever. But the deeper point is unsettling and thrilling at once. With these tools, no ancient death is ever truly closed. Some of these cases will never fully close, and that is worth sitting with. We know Takabuti was stabbed in the back, but her killer is gone. We can link the screaming mummy to Rameses III, yet scholars still argue over exactly which disgraced son he was. Bones record injury with brutal clarity, but they almost never record motive, the one thing a detective most wants to know. And even the cases we call solved keep cracking open again as methods improve, as protein analysis and sharper DNA reveal things the first study missed. There is an ethical weight here, too, in studying sacrificed children and executed prisoners and putting their wounds on a screen. These were real people with names and fears, and it is worth remembering that the striking images and the clean answers come from bodies that suffered. It is also why matching a body to a surviving text is so powerful and so rare. When a saga, a papyrus, or a chronicle turns out to describe a real skeleton, two completely separate kinds of evidence, the written word and the human remains, suddenly agree, and a story stops being a story. What ties all 12 together is a single thread. Each was a violent or hidden death, quietly waiting, sometimes for thousands of years, until science finally gave it an explanation. A Norse raider at the bottom of a well, an Egyptian noblewoman on display, a prince punished beyond death, a poisoned Italian lord, a child on a freezing volcano, an English king under a car park. All of them made to speak again, long after everyone who knew them turned to dust. And there are countless more still lying in museum drawers and mountain ice, holding secrets that only a test not yet invented will one day read. The deep past is a case file that never really closes. If the deep past still has questions for you, there is another investigation waiting on your screen right now, and subscribing keeps them coming.